The ships arrived off the coast of Roanoke Island on the 18th of August, 1590, in the specific way that ships arrive at a destination after a long and difficult passage, with the particular mixture of relief and anticipation that the sight of a familiar shore produces in people who have been too long at sea. John White had been away for 3 years. He had left the island on the 27th of August, 1587, promising to return within a few months with the supplies that the colony he had founded required to survive its first winter in the New World. 3 years had passed, 3 years of war and delay and frustration, and the specific anguish of a man who understood, in the most personal terms imaginable, what was at stake on the island he was returning to. His daughter Eleanor was there, his son-in-law Ananias there, and his granddaughter Virginia there, who had been born on the island on the 18th of August, 1587, exactly 3 years before the ships dropped anchor offshore. Virginia there was the first English child born in the Americas, a fact that her grandfather had recorded with the pride of a man who understood he was witnessing the beginning of something historic, a moment in the long story of the English presence in the New World that would be remembered and recounted. He was coming home to them. He was returning to the colony he had built, and the people who depended on him, and the child who represented everything that the English venture in the New World was supposed to be about, the beginning of a permanent presence, the first generation of English Americans. When the landing party made its way to the shore on the morning of August 18th, they found the settlement empty, not destroyed, not burned, not the scene of any obvious violence or catastrophe, but simply empty, silent, abandoned. The palisade that had been built around the settlement was still standing, more substantial than anything White had left behind, suggesting that the colonists had continued to improve their defenses after his departure. There were signs that things had been taken away in an orderly manner rather than abandoned in panic. White's own belongings, which he had buried before departing, had been found and disturbed, many of them rusted and damaged by 3 years of exposure to the elements of coastal Carolina. And there were the carvings. On a tree near the settlement, the letters CRO had been cut into the bark, carved clearly and deliberately, rather than scratched hastily. On a post of the palisade itself, more complete, Croatoan. The single word, carved in capital letters, was the only message the colony had left for the man who had sailed across the Atlantic to find them. White knew what the word meant. Before he had departed in 1587, the colonists had agreed on a signal system for exactly the circumstance in which he now found himself. If they moved from the island, they were to carve their destination into a conspicuous place. If the move was under duress, if they were fleeing some danger or emergency, they were to add a cross to the carving, the specific symbol that would tell White that the departure had not been voluntary, that something had gone wrong. There was no cross. There was no distress signal. There was only the word, Croatoan. Croatoan was not a mystery. It was an answer. It named a place 50 miles to the south, on the island that the English called Croatoan, and that we know now as Hatteras Island, where the people called the Croatoan lived. It named a people with whom the colonists had established what passed, by the specific and often bloody standards of early English colonialism, for a genuine relationship of mutual respect and practical cooperation. And it named a destination, a direction, a choice. The colonists of Roanoke had not vanished into some inexplicable void. They had gone somewhere. They had told White exactly where they had gone. They had done so with the deliberateness of people who were making a planned move rather than a desperate flight. John White could not go to Croatoan. The weather made it impossible. The privateers, who had finally agreed to bring him back to the colony, were impatient to pursue Spanish prizes and had no interest in spending more time on the Carolina coast searching for lost colonists. A storm threatened the ships. The anchors were weighed, and the fleet turned toward the open sea. White watched Roanoke Island recede behind him and died, years later, still having never gone to Hatteras Island to find out what had happened to his daughter and his granddaughter and the rest of the 115 people who had sailed with him to the New World in 1587. The story of the lost colony of Roanoke is, in the nearly 440 years since White's return, one of the most debated and most persistently romanticized mysteries in American history. It has generated novels and films and documentaries and an outdoor drama that has been performed on the Carolina coast for decades. It has become a symbol of the precariousness of the colonial enterprise, of the vulnerability of those first English people who dared to cross the Atlantic and attempt to build something permanent in a land that was already fully occupied by people with their own complex societies and their own ideas about who belonged there and under what terms. But the mystery has been treated, for most of its long life in the American imagination, as if it were unsolvable, as if the silence of the island in August 1590 represented a genuine erasure rather than a departure that left behind its own evidence. The colonists left a message. The message pointed to a destination, and in the 4 centuries since, the question has never been properly whether they went to Croatoan, but what happened to them there, and what the physical evidence of their integration into the Croatoan community might tell us about the specific form their survival took. The answer to that question is still being assembled, piece by piece, from the soil of Hatteras Island and the documentary record of the period and the oral traditions of the people who carry, or may carry, the genetic legacy of those 115 English men and women and children. What is already clear from the evidence available in the first decades of the 21st century is that the lost colony of Roanoke was probably not as lost as its name suggests, that the specific word carved into the palisade post was not a farewell, but a forwarding address, and that the fate of the first English Americans was not annihilation, but absorption into a world they had chosen over the one that had forgotten them. To understand why that choice makes sense, and what the evidence for it actually shows, it is necessary to go back to the beginning, to the specific circumstances that brought 115 English people to Roanoke Island in 1587, and that left them there, without adequate supplies, in an uncertain relationship with the indigenous peoples of the region, waiting for a governor who would not return for 3 years. Sir Walter Raleigh received his royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I in 1584, a document that authorized him to discover and take possession of remote heathen and barbarous lands not actually possessed by any Christian prince. The standard language of 16th century colonial entitlement that the European powers used to wave away the established presence of the people who were already living in the places they intended to colonize. Raleigh was one of the most energetic and ambitious figures at the Elizabethan court, a man who combined genuine intellectual curiosity about the New World with the harder commercial calculations of someone who understood that the establishment of English colonies in North America was partly a geopolitical project, a way of challenging Spanish dominance in the Western Hemisphere, and partly a commercial venture, a way of creating English access to the resources and trade opportunities that the Americas represented. In 1584, Raleigh sent out a reconnaissance expedition under Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow to explore the coast of the territory that the English were beginning to call Virginia in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. Amadas and Barlow made landfall on the outer banks of what is now North Carolina, explored the area, and returned to England with enthusiasm and with something considerably more valuable than a geographic survey. They brought 2 men. Manteo was Croatoan, Wanches was Roanoke. They had agreed, or been persuaded, to return to England with the English explorers, and they spent the following year in England, learning the English language and providing the Raleigh enterprise with information about the peoples and the geography of the region they had come from. They were not the first indigenous Americans to visit England, but they were among the most significant in terms of the impact their presence had on the specific English venture that was developing around Raleigh's charter. Manteo, particularly, seems to have formed a genuine relationship with the English, a relationship that went beyond the instrumental purpose he served as interpreter and informant, and that would eventually lead to his baptism and his formal designation as Lord of Roanoke, titles that the English bestowed with the specific mix of cultural imposition and genuine respect that characterized their engagement with indigenous people at their best moments. He returned to the Outer Banks with the English, crossed the Atlantic multiple times, and ultimately became the most important intermediary between the English colony and the indigenous world it was trying to exist within. His role in what happened to the 1587 colony is central, and it connects directly to the specific evidence that modern archaeology has been assembling for the past 20 years. The first English settlement on Roanoke Island was not the 1587 colony, but the 1585 military expedition under Ralph Lane. Lane and his men established a fort on the northern end of Roanoke Island, explored the surrounding region extensively, and spent a year learning things about the territory and its people that would shape every subsequent English engagement with the region. The learning was not uniformly positive. The relationship between Lane's colony and the indigenous Roanoke people deteriorated over the course of the year, partly because of the colony's dependence on indigenous food supplies at a time when those supplies were under strain from the English presence, and partly because of the specific miscalculations of men who were trained for military confrontation rather than for the delicate work of establishing a viable long-term coexistence. The deterioration culminated in a violent confrontation in which Lane's men killed Wingina, the paramount chief of the Roanoke people, and several of his leading men, a killing that Lane justified on the grounds of a preempted conspiracy against the English, but that was, by any honest assessment, the act of a colonial military force, eliminating a native leader who had become inconvenient. Lane's colony was then evacuated when Francis Drake stopped by with his fleet, on his way back from raiding Spanish settlements in the Caribbean, offering the colonists passage home that most of them were happy to accept. The violence of the Lane period, and the food demands and general disruption that the English presence had created, had damaged the English relationship with the indigenous peoples of the region in ways that the 187 colony would inherit. What it had not damaged was the specific relationship with the Croatoan people, who had maintained their alliance with the English through the Lane period, and who remained, when the 1587 colony arrived, the most reliable indigenous allies the English had in the region. The 1587 colony was conceived as a different kind of venture from the military expeditions that had preceded it. Raleigh wanted to establish a permanent settlement, which meant sending not soldiers but families, not temporary residents but people who intended to stay. The colonists were recruited as potential settlers in a community that was supposed to be self-sustaining, capable of producing its own food and managing its own governance, laying the foundation for what Raleigh and his backers imagined would become an English presence in North America that would rival the Spanish settlements of the Caribbean and the mainland. The specific people who sailed in 1587 were not the great names of English history, not the aristocracy or the gentry, but the middling sort of people who made up the backbone of Tudor England's ambitious and restless middle class, craftsmen and farmers and their families, people with specific skills and a willingness to risk the crossing for the possibility of a different life on the other side. There were 115 of them in total, including about 17 women and at least 9 children. Among them was John White himself, the colony's appointed governor, an artist and cartographer of genuine talent whose maps and watercolors of the indigenous peoples and the natural world of the Carolina coast are some of the most significant visual records of early contact between England and North America. White had been with the 1585 expedition and had used the time there to document everything he saw with a precision and a sympathy that set his work apart from the more utilitarian records of military expeditions. These images of the Algonquian people of the coast are remarkable for their attention to specificity and their avoidance of the grosser forms of European condescension toward indigenous peoples, portraits of real people in the full particularity of their lives, rather than types representing savagery or exoticism. Eleanor White had married Ananias Dare, and she was pregnant when the colony sailed. She was White's daughter and the governor's immediate family, and her presence in the colony reflected both the English conception of the settlement as a family enterprise and White's own deep personal investment in its success. When she gave birth on the 18th of August, 1587, to a daughter named Virginia, the first English child born in the Americas, it was both a symbolic triumph for the colonial enterprise and a very personal event for a grandfather who would be separated from his granddaughter almost immediately by the demands of the colony's desperate situation. The desperate situation was a product of the specific decisions made before the colony even reached its destination. The intended destination was not Roanoke Island, but the Chesapeake Bay, further north, where the English believed the conditions were more favorable for settlement and where the specific coastal geography offered a better harbor. But the expedition's captain, Simon Fernandez, a Portuguese pilot in English service, refused to take the colonists further than Roanoke, depositing them on the island that the 1585 colony had already established, and then abandoning them there with the supplies he had brought and the knowledge that the Chesapeake plan was not going to happen. The reasons for Fernandez's decision are debated by historians. He may have been motivated by the desire to begin the privateering activities against the Spanish shipping that were the other commercial purpose of the expedition, activities that would be better served by an early departure from the Carolina coast than by an extended stay. He may have had other reasons, personal or commercial, for preferring the Roanoke location. Whatever his motivation, the effect was to leave 115 colonists on an island where the English had already antagonized the local indigenous population and where the agricultural infrastructure necessary for self-sufficiency was not in place. The colonists found the site of the 1585 colony in a state of partial decay and discovered that the 15 men whom Richard Grenville had left there as a holding force the previous year had disappeared, with only one skeleton remaining to indicate what had happened to them. The indigenous situation was complicated, with some tribes hostile and others, principally the Croatoan, still friendly. The combination of a difficult indigenous environment and inadequate supplies made the immediate future uncertain enough that the colonists quickly concluded they needed resupply from England, and they persuaded John White, against his own inclinations, to return across the Atlantic to manage the acquisition and dispatch of that resupply. He left on the 27th of August, 1587, carrying the specific weight of a man who is doing what the situation requires, while knowing that the situation he is leaving behind is more fragile than he would like. He had arranged with the colonists the signal system, the agreement about carving a destination on the palisade with the addition of a cross if the departure was under duress, and he had their commitment to maintain the settlement until he returned. He promised to come back with supplies as quickly as he could. What followed was 3 years of frustration that represent one of the longest and most consequential delays in the history of colonial enterprise. White arrived back in England to find the country consumed by the most significant military crisis of Elizabeth's reign, the threatened invasion of the Spanish Armada, the massive fleet that Philip II of Spain had assembled to cross the Channel, land a Spanish army in England, and end English Protestant independence. Every ship in England that could be equipped for military use was being pressed into service for the defense of the realm. White's appeals for a resupply mission were subordinated to the national emergency. The Armada was defeated in the summer of 1588, scattered by English naval action and destroyed by storms in the waters around the British Isles. But the defeat did not end the war with Spain or release English shipping from its military commitments. White managed to secure 2 small vessels for a 1588 resupply attempt, but the ships were attacked by French privateers and turned back before reaching the Americas. The 1589 attempt failed before it began. It was not until 1590, 3 years after his departure, that White finally secured passage on a fleet of privateers who agreed to stop at Roanoke in the course of their voyage. The 1590 return was both belated and inadequate. The privateers were not interested in the colony except as a brief diversion from the more profitable business of attacking Spanish shipping, and when the weather deteriorated after White's arrival at the island and made the planned visit to Croatoan impossible, they had no hesitation about abandoning the search. White was left with the carved word and no ability to follow it, no means of completing the investigation that the evidence in front of him pointed toward. A man who knew the answer was 50 miles to the south and could not go to find it. He returned to England. He wrote an account of the 1590 voyage that includes the description of what he found, and the account is careful and specific in ways that are consistent with the systematic, observational temperament that his artistic work displays. He was not sensationalizing. He was not dramatizing. He was recording what he had seen with the attention to accurate detail of a mapmaker and an artist who understood that the record he was creating mattered. The account is one of the primary sources for everything that followed. White makes no suggestion in his account that he believed the colonists were dead or that the Croatoan carving indicated anything other than their destination. He was frustrated by his inability to go there. He hoped that a subsequent voyage would allow him to make the 50-mile journey and find his family. That subsequent voyage never happened. White appears to have died sometime around 1593, never having returned to the Americas, never having found out what became of his daughter and his granddaughter and the rest of the colony he had helped to build, and then abandoned by the requirements of the emergency he had not anticipated. The Croatoan people, the people who gave the colony their destination sign, and who had maintained their alliance with the English through all the complications of the Lane period and the uncertain first months of the 1587 colony, occupied Hatteras Island, the long barrier island south of Roanoke that the English called Croatoan Island. They were one of the Algonquian-speaking peoples of the Carolina coast, related to, but distinct from, the Roanoke people and the other tribes of the interior, and their specific geography on the outer banks gave them a relationship to the sea and to European contact that was different from the more landlocked peoples of the mainland. Manteo, the Croatoan man who had sailed to England twice and who had served as interpreter and guide for multiple English expeditions, was their most visible representative in the English records. His specific status among his own people and the specific authority he held or represented when he returned from England is not entirely clear from the records, but his mother was described as a significant figure in Croatoan society, suggesting that he came from a prominent family. His willingness to engage with the English, to cross the Atlantic, and to learn their language, and to serve as an intermediary between the two worlds, reflects both personal qualities of curiosity and adaptability, and possibly a family or community strategy of managing the English presence through engagement rather than resistance. The English baptism of Manteo, which took place on August 13, 1587, shortly after the colony's arrival on the island, and his designation as Lord of Roanoke was one of those characteristic acts of the English colonial enterprise that had the appearance of honor and the substance of appropriation, the use of English forms and English titles to incorporate indigenous people into an English hierarchy without fully consulting them on whether that was an arrangement they desired. Manteo appears to have accepted the designation without objecting to it, though what he actually understood himself to be agreeing to in those terms may have been quite different from what the English understood. What mattered for the colonists' relationship with the Croatoan was not the formal titles but the practical reality of a functional alliance in a situation where the colonists needed allies badly and the Croatoan had decided, for their own reasons, that maintaining a relationship with the English was in their interest. The specific form that interest took, and whether it reflected primarily pragmatic calculations about trade and military alliance, or something more personal in the case of the relationships that had developed around Manteo, is something the historical record suggests rather than states explicitly. The colonists' decision to go to Croatoan when they left Roanoke, if that is what the carving meant, and if that is what they did, makes complete sense in this context. They were people who had been on the island for 3 years without the resupply they needed and without the government they had been promised. They had managed, somehow, the entire period from 1587 to 1590 with the resources they had and with whatever assistance they could arrange with the indigenous people in their vicinity. They were alive, or at least alive enough to have left a deliberate, organized message rather than the signs of catastrophe. And when they left, they went toward the people who had been most consistently friendly to them, toward the island that Manteo called home. This is not a mysterious decision. It is a survival decision made by people who understood their situation clearly enough to communicate it in the form of a specific place name rather than a distress signal. Croatoan was where they would find food, shelter, and the specific kind of reception that the people of that island had consistently offered them. It may also have been where Manteo was, depending on his movements in the period between 1587 and 1590, and Manteo's presence would have been both a practical asset and a symbolic statement about the nature of the relationship the colonists were seeking. The physical evidence that has accumulated in the period since 2010 from the archaeological work conducted on Hatteras Island by the First Colony Foundation and its partners has given the Croatoan theory a material foundation that it previously lacked. The oral tradition and the documentary record pointed toward Hatteras Island as the colonists' destination, but oral tradition and documentary records, particularly those of the relevant period, carry uncertainty that physical evidence can resolve or at least substantiate. The discoveries at the specific archaeological sites on Hatteras Island have included objects that are unmistakably English in origin and that have no obvious explanation other than the presence of English people in the Croatoan community. A fragment of a Cistercian-type slipware ceramic, a type of pottery made in England in the late 16th century, found in a context that places it in a late 16th or early 17th century deposit alongside Native American artifacts, is the kind of object that the colonists of Roanoke might have brought with them and that their Croatoan hosts might have kept or used after the English arrived. A sword-hilt fragment, also of a type consistent with late 16th century English manufacture, found in the same context, further suggests English presence. The key word in interpreting these finds is integration. The English objects were found not in a separate English deposit, not in the remains of an English structure distinct from the indigenous settlement, but within a Native American context, mixed with Native American artifacts in a way that suggests that whatever English people were present on Hatteras Island in that period were not living separately from the Croatoan, but were living among them, sharing their material world in the specific way that comes from sustained daily coexistence rather than from trade or brief contact. This is precisely what the Croatoan theory predicts. The colonists of Roanoke, if they went to Hatteras Island, would not have established a separate English settlement there. They would have joined the existing Croatoan community, integrating into its social structure to whatever degree was possible given the cultural and linguistic barriers involved, adopting aspects of the Croatoan way of life, while presumably retaining some of their own cultural practices and material possessions. The archaeological signature of such an integration would look exactly like what the excavations have found: English objects in a native context, the material traces of a meeting of two peoples that left neither unchanged. The geographical picture has been further complicated by the discovery of a secret hidden on one of John White's own maps. White produced a detailed map of the coastal region during the 1585 expedition, and this map was revised and corrected in subsequent years. In 2012, analysis by the British Museum of a copy of this map, held in the Sloan collection, revealed, under X-ray and other imaging techniques, that a small patch had been applied to the map and painted over, concealing something that White or someone else had wanted to hide. Beneath the patch, revealed by the imaging, was a symbol, a fort, drawn in a style consistent with the other forts shown on the map, located in the interior of the Carolina mainland, significantly inland from the coast, at a position that placed it near the confluence of rivers that would have provided access to a broader territory. The hidden fort symbol on White's map has been interpreted by researchers as indicating a planned or actual inland relocation of some part of the colony, a second destination beyond or in addition to Croatoan. If the colonists split, with some going to Hatteras Island and others moving inland, or if some of the Hatteras Island group subsequently moved to the mainland location marked on the map, the picture of what happened to the colony becomes more complex and more geographically dispersed than a simple move to Croatoan Island would suggest. This complexity is consistent with what would actually happen to a group of 115 people integrating into an indigenous community. The integration would not have been static or uniform. People would have moved, married, had children, formed new alliances with different communities. Some might have stayed on Hatteras Island permanently. Others might have moved with Croatoan families to seasonal camps or permanent villages elsewhere. The specific individual fates of 115 people integrating into a complex social world over a period of years would not have produced a single archaeological site, but a dispersal, traces left at multiple locations across the region. The Dere stones entered the story of the lost colony in 1937, when a traveler named L.E. Rawlings claimed to have found a stone near Edenton, North Carolina, while traveling along a road in the Chowan River area. The stone was approximately 2 feet long and 1 foot wide, engraved on both sides, with text that purported to be a message from Eleanor White Dare, the governor's daughter, chronicling the fate of the colony. The inscription described deaths from disease, from hostile attacks, from the specific difficulties of survival in an unfamiliar world, and it described a trek westward with the Croatoan people. The stone was brought to the attention of Haywood Pierce Jr., a history professor at Brenau College in Gainesville, Georgia, who became deeply invested in its authentication. Pierce found the inscription plausible, the language and the substance consistent with what might be expected of a 16th-century English woman writing under duress, and he pursued the stone's authentication with the conviction of a man who believed he had stumbled upon a genuinely significant historical document. Between 1937 and 1940, 47 more stones appeared. They were found across a wide area of Georgia and North Carolina, each purportedly from Eleanor Dare, each continuing the narrative of the colony's westward movement and diminishing numbers. The stones were brought to Pierce, who authenticated most of them, and the story they told became a kind of tragic epic, a small group of survivors moving inland through an increasingly hostile landscape, dying one by one from disease and violence. Eleanor herself the last of the original colonists, before finally dying, and the stones falling to the care of her children by a native husband. The authenticity of the stones was debated from the beginning. The initial stone, the Edenton stone, was examined by various scholars who found the language plausible, but the physical evidence of the engraving more ambiguous than definitive. The subsequent 47 stones attracted much more serious scrutiny, and in 1940, a Saturday Evening Post investigation concluded that most of them were almost certainly fraudulent, the product of an opportunistic hoax that had exploited Pierce's credulity and the public's appetite for a dramatic resolution to the Roanoke mystery. The Smithsonian Institution examined the stones and reached a similarly skeptical conclusion. The narrative they told was too convenient, too complete, too perfectly tailored to the emotional needs of an audience that wanted a tragic but coherent resolution to the mystery. The geological analysis of the later stones suggested that the patination of the engravings was inconsistent with stones that had been exposed for 350 years, which was what genuine Eleanor Dare stones would have required to be. The Dare stones were largely dismissed as hoaxes in the academic community, and they remain in a state of semi-dismissal today. Most scholars regard them as fraudulent, the product of an elaborate and probably profit-motivated scheme that took advantage of a genuine mystery, while a small number of researchers have continued to argue that the first stone, the Edenton stone, deserves more careful consideration than the blanket dismissal of the later hoaxes has allowed. The ongoing uncertainty about the first stone reflects a more general principle of historical investigation. The exposure of a series of hoaxes does not by itself prove that the original that inspired the hoaxes was also fraudulent. If someone found a genuine Eleanor Dare stone, and the story it told became sufficiently well known to inspire imitators who then produced fraudulent copies, the fraudulence of the copies would not necessarily infect the original. The first stone has not been definitively proved to be a hoax, and it has not been definitively proved to be genuine. What the Dare stones, even in their uncertainty, suggest is the persistence of a narrative about the colony's westward movement with the Croatoan people, a movement that would be consistent with the documented patterns of Croatoan seasonal life and with the kind of integration that 115 English people joining a native community would have produced. Whether the stones are genuine documents of that movement or inventions by someone who understood the general outline of what probably happened, they describe a scenario that is consistent with the physical evidence and with the documentary record. The genetic research conducted on the Lumbee people of North Carolina and on the descendant communities of the Hatteras area has produced results that are suggestive without being conclusive, which is an appropriate level of certainty for genetic research applied to a historical question of this antiquity and complexity. The Lumbee people, who number around 60,000 and live primarily in Robeson County, North Carolina, have maintained a claim of descent from the Roanoke colonists since at least the 19th century. They speak English rather than any indigenous language, a fact that has been offered as evidence of an English origin that caused them to lose their ancestral language, though this explanation is contested. Some Lumbee surnames match the surnames of colonists who sailed in 1587. Chavis, Sampson, and others appear in both the colony's roster and in the Lumbee community. The surname correspondence is not definitive proof of descent, since surnames can be adopted for various reasons across generations, but it is the kind of circumstantial evidence that accumulates alongside other circumstantial evidence to create a picture that demands explanation. Genetic analysis of the Hatteras and Lumbee communities has found patterns consistent with a historical admixture of European and Native American ancestry, though the dating and specific origin of the European contribution is difficult to establish precisely at this remove. The limitation of genetic evidence for this specific question is that a European genetic contribution to a Native American community in coastal North Carolina might come from many sources across the 4 centuries since the colony's disappearance, including later colonial contacts, slave owners and enslaved people, traders and settlers of all subsequent periods. Distinguishing a late 16th century English contribution from later European contributions requires a precision that current genetic methods cannot achieve with certainty. The alternative theories for the fate of the colony deserve honest examination, because the Croatoan integration theory, for all its evidential support, is not proven. Intellectual honesty requires acknowledging the scenarios that have been proposed as alternatives. The Spanish attack theory has some evidentiary basis that sets it apart from pure speculation. The Spanish had an intelligence network that monitored English attempts to establish colonies in North America, which the Spanish regarded as intrusions into territories claimed by the Spanish crown. There is documentary evidence that Spanish officials were aware of the Roanoke colony and were considering what to do about it. An expedition from Spanish Florida might theoretically have destroyed the colony, and the absence of the colonists when White returned would be consistent with either a successful attack that killed or captured them, or a flight that the attack's approach had caused. The problem with the Spanish attack theory is the carving. A Spanish attack would have given the colonists no time to carve Croatoan into the palisade post, and even if some survived to do so, the message would more naturally have described an attack rather than a destination. The colonists had agreed on a distress signal. They did not use it. The carving is the work of people who were not under immediate attack, who were making a planned departure to a specific location. A Spanish attack explains the disappearance only if it is combined with the assumption that the carving was made for some reason other than the obvious one, which is the assumption that least fits the evidence. The hostile indigenous attack theory has somewhat more complexity. The period between 1587 and 1590 was a time of significant tension between English interests and the indigenous peoples of the region, and the accounts gathered by the Jamestown colonists in 1607 and the years following included stories of English people being killed by indigenous forces, stories that some historians have interpreted as referring to survivors of the Roanoke colony. The paramount chief Powhatan, who dominated the indigenous political landscape of the region when Jamestown was founded, was reported to have boasted of killing a group of English people who had been living among the Chesapeake tribe near the coast, a description that might refer to the Roanoke colonists or might refer to some other group of English people whose presence in the region has not otherwise been documented. The Powhatan accounts are genuine historical evidence that deserves to be taken seriously, but they do not necessarily contradict the Croatoan theory. If the colony split after leaving Roanoke, with some going to Hatteras Island and others moving toward the Chesapeake, the people killed by Powhatan might have been a splinter group that tried to make contact with the Chesapeake tribe, while the larger group remained on or near Hatteras Island. The two accounts, the Croatoan carving and the Powhatan story, might both be true and might refer to different subsets of the same population. Disease is a constant factor in any account of the encounter between European colonists and indigenous peoples in the Americas. The epidemiological catastrophe that European contact caused to indigenous communities through the introduction of diseases to which indigenous peoples had no immunity also worked in the other direction to a more limited extent, with European colonists encountering diseases and environmental conditions to which they were poorly adapted. The Roanoke colonists were in a new environment, eating unfamiliar food, exposed to pathogens their immune systems had not encountered. Disease may have killed some of them, both before and after any move to Croatoan Island. But disease killing all 115 people without leaving any physical trace, without producing the kind of mass grave or scattered remains that would have been visible to White if he had visited Hatteras Island, is not a satisfying explanation. The Croatoan theory does not require all 115 people to have survived, only enough of them to have made a coherent and planned departure from Roanoke Island and to have integrated into the Croatoan community in ways that left the archaeological traces that modern excavation has begun to find. The word Croatoan, carved into the palisade post, is, in the end, the most important piece of evidence in the entire case, not because it resolves all uncertainty, but because it is the only direct communication we have from the colonists themselves, the only message they were able to leave for the person who was coming to look for them. White understood it as a destination. He was the person who had established the signal system, who knew the colonists, who understood the context. His interpretation of the carving as indicating where they had gone rather than what had killed them is the interpretation that someone with direct knowledge chose. The absence of the distress cross is equally important and equally clear in its implication. The colonists knew how to signal distress. They had agreed on the signal. They did not use it. Whatever drove them to leave Roanoke Island was not the kind of immediate, overwhelming danger that the distress signal was designed to communicate. It was something else, a decision, a choice, a recognition that the life they had been attempting to build in that specific location was not going to work, and that another option was available. The other option was Croatoan. The people there knew them, or at least knew some of them. Manteo was Croatoan. The relationship between the colony and the Croatoan had been the most consistently positive of all the English relationships with the indigenous peoples of the region. The journey from Roanoke to Hatteras Island was about 50 miles by water, manageable with the small boats the colony would have had, and the welcome at the end of the journey was, based on everything the colonists knew about the Croatoan, likely to be genuinely welcoming. What happened after their arrival is what the archaeology is beginning to tell us. The English pottery in a native context, the sword-hilt fragment among Native American artifacts, the material evidence of a meeting of two cultures that changed both of them, not violently but persistently, not through conquest but through the specific, intimate, daily processes of people living together, sharing food and children and language and the small technologies of daily life. Virginia Dare, if she survived the journey to Hatteras Island, would have grown up in the Croatoan world. She would have learned the Croatoan language, perhaps alongside English, or perhaps instead of it, depending on how many English speakers survived to teach it to her. She might have married a Croatoan man. She might have had children who were English and Croatoan in equal measure, the first generation of a mixing that has continued in the communities of the Carolina coast and the interior to the present day. She was the first English person born in the Americas, and she may also have been among the first people to live a life that was neither fully English nor fully Algonquian, but something new, something that had not existed before her birth, and that exists now in the genetic and cultural inheritance of the communities that claim her as an ancestor. The word carved into the post was not a mystery. It never was a mystery. John White knew what it meant when he saw it, and he was frustrated not by its obscurity, but by his inability to follow where it pointed. 3 years of absence, of war and delay, and the specific indifference of a colonial enterprise to the people it had planted and then forgotten, had not erased the message. The colonists had waited as long as they could, and then they had made the decision that their situation required. They went to the people who were willing to have them. They carved their destination into the wood for the governor who was coming back to find them, and then they took whatever they could carry, and they walked down to the shore, and they got in the boats, and they pointed south, toward the island 50 miles away, where the smoke of Croatoan fires would have been visible on a clear day. The English crown would eventually establish permanent colonies in North America without knowing what had happened to the first attempt. The Virginia Company would plant Jamestown in 1607, and it would survive, barely, and from that survival the English colonial enterprise would grow into something the Roanoke colonists could not have imagined. Their own experiment, the first attempt, the 115 people who sailed with John White in 1587, would become a story told about mystery and loss, about the darkness of the American wilderness swallowing the light of English civilization. But that was not what happened. The darkness did not swallow them. The American wilderness did not consume them. What happened was more interesting, more human, more specific than any of the legends that grew up around their absence. They survived. They adapted. They chose the people who were there, the people who were willing to feed them and shelter them and receive their children and give them a future in the land they had crossed the Atlantic to find. They let go of the empire that had sent them and then forgotten them, and they held on to the life that the Croatoan were willing to share. The word Croatoan was not a cry for help and not a last, desperate notation of a people facing extinction. It was an address, a forwarding direction, a message left by people who were, in August of 1590, not lost at all, but found, in the only way that the specific circumstances of their situation allowed them to be found. The archaeology continues. The evidence accumulates. The soil of Hatteras Island gives up more fragments of the material life of people who lived there 4 centuries ago, English and Croatoan together, their lives and their possessions intermixed in ways that the instruments of 21st century archaeology can read, but that the people of the 16th century would have understood immediately. We are here. We are alive. We made our choice. The lost colony of Roanoke was not lost. It was simply somewhere that the empire that sent it was not willing to look. The specific demographic of the 1587 colony, the mix of people who had chosen to cross the Atlantic on the promise of a new life, deserves closer attention than the legend of the lost colony usually provides. The narrative of the colony as it exists in popular imagination tends to focus on the mystery and the symbols, on the carved word, and the enigmatic governor and the birth of Virginia Dare as the first English American, but the 115 people who were actually present on the island were specific individuals with specific histories and specific skills and specific relationships to each other and to the enterprise they had joined. The colony included craftsmen, farmers, and laborers with the skills that a self-sustaining settlement required. There were people who knew how to build, how to fish, how to farm, how to make the daily calculations that keeping a group of people alive and functional required. There were families, which is to say, there were children, and there were the specific social bonds and obligations that families create, the ties that make a community more than a collection of individuals and that give it the internal coherence necessary to make collective decisions and maintain collective commitments. The 12 assistants who formed the colony's governing council alongside White were men of substance by the standards of their time and their class, people like Ananias Dare, Roger Pratt, George Howe, Roger Bailey, and others who had status enough to be appointed to the council and whose decision-making authority was established in the colony's charter. George Howe was killed by indigenous people while he was crabbing shortly after the colony's arrival, a loss that demonstrated both the dangers of the situation and the reality that even the governing class of the colony was not protected from the immediate physical risks of their environment. His death was one of the factors that led to the early assessment that the colony needed resupply quickly. The women of the colony are less well documented individually than the men, as is characteristic of the period, but their presence was significant both practically and symbolically. The women who made the voyage in 1587 were not decorative additions to a military expedition, but essential members of the intended permanent community, people with the domestic and agricultural skills that sustained daily life, and with the social roles that made a settlement a habitation rather than a camp. Eleanor White there was the most prominent among them because of her relationship to the governor and the birth of her daughter, but she was not unique in having chosen to take the risk of the crossing for the sake of a different life. The 115 colonists were people who had made a decision of enormous consequence with less information than they needed about the conditions they were sailing into. The reports brought back from previous expeditions had emphasized the fertility of the land and the friendliness of at least some of the indigenous people, and the specific difficulties that the Lane colony had experienced had been somewhat softened in the retelling. The colonists who boarded ships in 1587 knew they were going somewhere difficult and unknown, but the picture they had of that somewhere was probably more optimistic than the reality warranted. When they arrived at Roanoke and found that the intended destination of Chesapeake Bay had been overruled by the captain's decision to deposit them on the island, they were already in a situation that required adaptation. The specific problems they faced, the hostile indigenous environment left over from the Lane period, the inadequate supplies, the growing understanding that a single season's crops would not be sufficient to sustain them, all required the kind of flexible, pragmatic decision-making that survival in difficult circumstances demands. The decision to send White back to England was pragmatic and collective. The colonists as a group recognized that they needed what England could provide, specifically supplies and possibly reinforcements, and they concluded that the governor was the person best positioned to secure those things. White was reluctant because he understood what it meant to leave, what the specific vulnerability of the people he was leaving behind would be in his absence, but the consensus of the colony overrode his reluctance. The 3 years that followed, from White's departure in August 1587 to his return in August 1590, are 3 years from which the colonists' own voices and actions are entirely absent from the historical record. What they did, how they managed, who died and who survived, and what decisions were made, is not documented in any source that has been discovered. The archaeological record is beginning to fill some of that silence, but the specific narrative of the colony's daily life across those 3 years is one of the things that may never be fully recoverable. What can be inferred is that they were not simply sitting still and waiting for White to return. A community of 115 people required constant activity to maintain itself. Food production, water management, shelter maintenance, the management of illness and injury, and the social tensions that any group confined to a relatively small area inevitably generates. The Croatoan had agreed to look out for the colony's interests while White was away, a commitment that implies an ongoing relationship of some kind, periodic contact at minimum. The palisade that White found in 1590, more substantial than what he had left behind in 1587, suggests that the colonists had been active in their own defense and that they had been in the settlement long enough to significantly improve its fortifications. This, in turn, suggests that the departure from the island, whenever it occurred in the 3-year period, was not a flight from immediate danger, but a departure made from a position of relative stability, with enough time to plan and enough resources to manage an organized move. The specific timing of the departure is unknown. The colonists might have left for Croatoan soon after White's departure, reasoning that without the expected resupply, there was no point in maintaining a settlement that could not sustain itself. They might have stayed for 2 years, and left in the third year, having finally concluded that white was not coming back. They might have made a gradual move, with some going to Croatoan first, and others following later. The most that can be said is that the colony had left by the time white returned in August 1590, and that the manner of their leaving, the orderly palisade, the deliberately carved message, the absence of the distress signal, was consistent with a planned departure rather than an emergency evacuation. The relationship that developed between the English colonists and the Croatoan community, once the colonists arrived on Hatteras Island, would have been shaped by the specific social structures and norms of the Croatoan world, rather than by English expectations of what a colonial settlement looked like. The Croatoan had their own social organization, their own political hierarchy, their own rules about who lived where and who married whom, and how resources were shared and managed. The English colonists, arriving in numbers significant enough to be a practical challenge to the community's existing arrangements, would have had to find ways of fitting into those arrangements that the Croatoan found acceptable. Manteo's role in this integration, if he was present on Hatteras Island when the colonists arrived, would have been significant. He was the person who could speak both languages, who had personal relationships in both communities, who understood both sets of expectations, and could help translate not just words, but the deeper cultural expectations and social norms that determine whether two groups of people can successfully share a territory. His presence at the intersection of the two worlds, the English world he had visited twice, and the Croatoan world he had been born into, was exactly the kind of bridge that the specific situation required. The integration of the colonists into the Croatoan community would have happened through the most fundamental mechanisms of human social life: shared work, shared meals, shared space, the gradual development of friendships, and eventually more intimate bonds, the births of children who embodied both their parents' worlds in the specific, particular way of all children of mixed heritage. The English colonists brought skills that the Croatoan may have found useful: their metalworking, their specific knowledge of European agriculture, their literacy, their tools. The Croatoan brought what the English desperately needed: knowledge of the land, agricultural techniques adapted to the specific ecology of the region, the social network of relationships with neighboring peoples that made living in the region possible for people who were starting from nothing. The exchange of material culture that the archaeological evidence documents, the English pottery in a native context, the sword hilt among indigenous artifacts, is the physical trace of the social exchange that was happening alongside it. People who share a community share their possessions, use each other's tools, integrate the material technologies of their different backgrounds into a common daily life that is neither entirely English nor entirely Croatoan, but something new, something that has no existing category in either culture's framework. Virginia Dare, if she grew up in this integrated world, would have been one of the first people whose identity was entirely that something new. She was English by birth and parentage, the granddaughter of the colony's governor, the daughter of colonists who had crossed the Atlantic specifically to establish an English presence in the New World. She was also, by circumstance and by environment, and by the specific social world she grew up in, Croatoan, or at least as Croatoan as someone not born into the community could become. She was the first English American, but she was also, possibly, the first person for whom the distinction between English and American was meaningless, for whom the world she lived in was simply the world, without the categories that her grandfather's empire had brought to the New World and tried to impose on it. The legend that grew up around Virginia Dare in subsequent centuries is revealing of what American culture has wanted the story of the lost colony to be about. The Virginia Dare of legend is a tragic figure, a symbol of innocence, destroyed by the wilderness, a white woman in danger from the savage world that surrounded her. The actual Virginia there, if the Croatoan integration theory is correct, was something far more interesting and far more historically significant. A person who negotiated, perhaps successfully, the boundary between two worlds that English colonial policy insisted were separate and opposed. The First Colony Foundation's archaeological work, which has been ongoing for more than 2 decades, has produced a picture of Hatteras Island in the late 16th and early 17th centuries that is consistent with the kind of integration the Croatoan theory proposes. The site at Buxton on Hatteras Island, where the English artifacts have been found in a Native American context, appears to have been a significant Croatoan settlement in the relevant period, a community with access to trade goods from various sources, and with the specific kinds of cultural mixing that sustained contact with English people would have produced. The Foundation's work has been careful and rigorous, the product of professional archaeological practice that includes the full documentation of context, the precise recording of artifact positions and associations, and the systematic analysis of the material that is recovered. The conclusions drawn from the work are appropriately tentative, framed in terms of what is consistent with the evidence, rather than what the evidence proves, because the specific uncertainty of archaeological inference requires that tentativeness. But the pattern that emerges from the accumulated evidence is clear enough to be significant. English people were in the Croatoan community in the late 16th century, and they were there in a way that suggests integration rather than brief contact. The question of what happened to the descendants of that integration in the centuries that followed is where the oral tradition and the genetic research intersect with the archaeological evidence. The Lumbee people of Robeson County, North Carolina, have maintained for generations a claim of descent from the Roanoke colonists. The claim is contested by other scholars who point out that the Lumbee are linguistically complex and that their origins may involve multiple indigenous groups and various later European contacts, rather than a specific descent from the 1587 colony. But the claim has a persistence and a specificity that demands attention, and the genetic evidence, while not conclusive, is consistent with a history of European admixture in the Lumbee community that could date from the late 16th century. The surname evidence is similarly ambiguous but suggestive. When the missionary John Lawson visited the Hatteras area in the early 18th century, he noted that the indigenous people in the area spoke some English and that they claimed to have English ancestors. The claim might have been a cultural construct, a way of positioning the community in relation to the English colonial presence that was growing more dominant around them, or it might have been a genuine oral tradition of specific ancestry. The century and a half between the 1587 colony and Lawson's visit is long enough for specific memories to have become vague and symbolically elaborated, but short enough for some specific family memories to have persisted. The documentary record of the Jamestown period, which began in 1607, includes reports gathered by English colonists about the fate of the Roanoke colony. John Smith, one of Jamestown's leaders, collected intelligence from indigenous people about the earlier English presence in the region. The intelligence was fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, reflecting the difficulty of gathering accurate historical information through interpreters from people whose own historical sense-making was different from the English documentary tradition. But some of what Smith learned, and what subsequent Virginia governors learned, was consistent with the Croatoan integration theory. There were people of English descent in the indigenous communities of the region, people who wore English-style clothing, or maintained English objects, or spoke fragments of English. The specific reports of Powhatan's boasting about killing English people who had been living among the Chesapeake tribe which some historians have interpreted as referring to the Roanoke colonists, are more difficult to incorporate into the Croatoan theory. If some of the colonists moved to the Chesapeake area rather than remaining on Hatteras Island, and if those people were killed by Powhatan in his wars of consolidation with the Chesapeake tribe, then the Roanoke story has a more tragic ending for at least some of its participants than the integration theory suggests. The two accounts do not necessarily contradict each other, but they complicate the picture in ways that the simple Croatoan theory does not fully address. The possibility that the colony split, with some going to Hatteras Island and others making various attempts to reach the Chesapeake, which had been the original planned destination, is one that the evidence supports, at least circumstantially. A community of 115 people, managing their survival over 3 years without external support, in a region where different indigenous groups offered different conditions, would not necessarily have stayed together or made the same choices. Individual decisions, family decisions, subgroup decisions would all have shaped the eventual dispersal. The Croatoan carving tells us where the majority, or at least the decision-making core of the group, went when they left Roanoke. It does not necessarily tell us what happened to everyone. The full story of the lost colony of Roanoke is, in the end, not the story of 115 people who vanished without a trace, but the story of 115 people who made a choice, or a series of choices, in circumstances that required adaptation and that did not allow for the specific form of survival that their governor expected to find when he returned. They carved their answer into the wood of the palisade they had built, and then they left. The answer was clear enough. It pointed south, to the island where the people who were willing to receive them lived. The empire that sent them eventually established its permanent presence in North America without them, on the shores of a different bay, 17 years after they disappeared. That empire grew into something that would eventually cover the entire continent, displacing and destroying the indigenous peoples whose worlds the Roanoke colonists had joined. The specific irony of the colony's probable fate, the English people who chose integration with an indigenous community, absorbed into a world that their own culture's expansion would eventually threaten and diminish, is one that the 4 centuries since have given the story a specific and haunting resonance. The word on the palisade post has been interpreted as a mystery for 440 years. It is not a mystery. It is a message, a statement, an answer from people who had made their decision and wanted the governor to know where to find them. The fact that he couldn't go there, that the weather and the privateers and the indifference of the colonial enterprise to the specific people it had planted in the New World prevented him from following the arrow that the word drew toward Hatteras Island, is not the mystery. The mystery was always about what was on the other end of that arrow, what the integration into the Croatoan world actually looked like, and what it produced in the generations that followed. The archaeology is beginning to answer that question. The pottery fragment and the sword hilt and the other artifacts accumulating from the soil of Hatteras Island are the physical language of a meeting that happened there, a meeting between English people who had given up on waiting for their empire and the people who were willing to share their world with them. John White died without knowing what had happened to his daughter and his granddaughter. He spent whatever years remained to him after his final return from the Americas in a specific grief that the record of his later writings reflects in its silences and its carefully maintained hope. He kept saying that he expected another opportunity to sail back and find them, and perhaps he believed it, and perhaps the belief was simply what allowed him to continue. But Eleanor and Virginia Dare were not waiting for their empire to come back for them. They had found another world, the world that the word on the palisade pointed toward, and in that world they had whatever life the specific circumstances of their integration allowed them. The children of that life, if there were children, carried the mixing forward into generations that did not remember the specific crossing of the Atlantic or the specific names carved into the wood, but that carried in their bodies, and perhaps in fragments of their oral tradition, the evidence of what had happened when the empire forgot its people and the people found other people to belong to. The lost colony was not lost. The word told White where they were. The archaeology is telling us that they were there, in the community they named, for long enough to leave the traces that modern excavation can find. What they became there, and what their descendants have carried forward into the present, is still being discovered, still being assembled from the soil and the DNA and the oral tradition and the surnames that have persisted across 4 centuries. The answer was always Croatoan. It was an answer from the beginning. It just took 440 years to start looking where the answer pointed. The specific historical moment into which the 1587 colony stepped when it arrived on the Carolina coast is worth attending to more carefully than the legend of the lost colony typically allows, because the moment was not the blank or the background that the English colonial enterprise treated it as being, but was itself a complex, dynamic, politically charged world with its own history and its own ongoing dramas that the English arrival disrupted and complicated in ways that shaped the colony's fate. The Algonquian-speaking peoples of the Carolina coast in the late 16th century were not a single unified people, but a collection of related communities with their own internal politics, their own alliances and enmities, their own relationships to the land and to each other. The Roanoke people, from whose name the island took its English designation, were under the leadership of Wingina, who had also adopted the name Pemisapan, a political calculation that may reflect the specific complexity of his position as a leader trying to manage the English presence without either fully embracing it or directly confronting it. The Croatoan were a different people, with their own leadership and their own relationship to the English that had developed through the specific mechanism of Manteo's multiple crossings of the Atlantic. The Lane colony's killing of Wingina in 1586 was not simply a tactical decision made by a nervous colonial military commander. It was an act with political consequences across the entire regional indigenous world, changing the relationships between communities, shifting the power dynamics of the region, and creating grievances that the 1587 colony inherited and had to navigate. The English did not arrive in a politically neutral environment. They arrived in a world that their predecessors had already disrupted, and the specific forms of that disruption shaped the options available to the colonists who came after. The Croatoans' decision to maintain their alliance with the English through the period of the Lane colony's violence against the Roanoke people and through the years of the 1587 colony's presence on the island was not a passive or naive choice. It was a political calculation, presumably made by the community's leadership, including whatever role Manteo's family played in that leadership, that the benefits of the English alliance outweighed the risks and the costs. The specific nature of those benefits might have included access to English trade goods, the specific military advantage that English firearms provided in the ongoing politics of the region, and possibly the specific status that a connection to a distant and powerful foreign group conveyed in the indigenous political world. The arrival of the 1587 colonists on Hatteras Island, if that is what the Croatoan carving signified, would have been both a fulfillment of the alliance and a significant new challenge to the Croatoan community. 115 people, even distributed across a period of months or years, is a substantial addition to any community. The Croatoan village or villages on Hatteras Island in 1587 were not enormous by the standards of the region, and the incorporation of even a fraction of the colony's surviving members would have required significant social and economic adjustment. The English colonists brought specific skills and specific possessions that might have made the adjustment more manageable from the Croatoan perspective. English metalworking was significantly more advanced than indigenous metalworking in the region, and the tools and weapons that the colonists brought or could produce would have been valuable to the Croatoan, both for practical purposes and for trade with other communities. English knowledge of navigation and of the world beyond the Outer Banks would have been useful to a people whose coastal geography gave them a specific relationship to ocean travel and to the network of connections that the Atlantic trade represented. The colonists, for their part, needed everything the Croatoan could provide. They needed food, particularly in the first period, before any of them had learned enough about the local ecology to contribute significantly to their own subsistence. They needed shelter, either in the Croatoans' existing structures or with the Croatoans' assistance in building new ones. They needed the specific knowledge of the region that only the people who had lived there for generations could provide. Which plants were edible and which were poisonous, where the fish ran in which season, what the weather patterns of the coast meant, and how to prepare for them. The English craftsmen and farmers brought skills, but the application of those skills in a new environment required the local knowledge that the Croatoan possessed. The integration of English skills with Croatoan knowledge would have been, in practical terms, one of the most significant aspects of the colonists' absorption into the Croatoan community. The archaeological evidence of English objects in a native context is the material trace of that practical collaboration, the products of English craft used in a Croatoan daily life or kept as valued objects by people who understood their usefulness. The children born to mixed English and Croatoan couples in the generations after the colonists' arrival would have been the most complete embodiment of the integration the Croatoan theory describes. These children would have grown up in a community that was neither fully English nor fully Croatoan, but was something new, speaking languages and practicing technologies and occupying social positions that did not exist before the colonists arrived. They would have been the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who carved Croatoan into the palisade post, carrying in their bodies and their memories the specific inheritance of that choice. The Lumbee people's claim of descent from the Roanoke colonists is complicated by the fact that the Lumbee were not, historically, a Hatteras Island people. They lived in the interior of North Carolina, in the area around the Lumber River that gives them their name. The geographical distance between Hatteras Island and the Lumbee homeland raises the question of how, if the colonists integrated into the Croatoan community on Hatteras Island, their descendants ended up in the interior of the state rather than on the coast. The answer, if there is one, may lie in the broader patterns of indigenous population movement that characterized the period between the late 16th century and the Lumbee's first documentation in the 18th century. The epidemics that followed European contact decimated indigenous populations throughout the Americas, including along the Carolina coast. The surviving members of communities, destroyed by disease, often merged with neighboring communities, creating new populations that drew on multiple ancestral groups. A group that had Croatoan and English ancestry, displaced from Hatteras Island by the combination of epidemic mortality and the growing pressure of European colonial expansion, might have moved inland and eventually merged with other displaced groups to form the community that became the Lumbee. This is a speculative chain of causation, and responsible historians are careful to note that the specific history of the Lumbee people is both more complex and less certain than any single ancestral narrative captures. The Lumbee themselves have complex internal discussions about their ancestry and identity, discussions that reflect the genuine diversity of their origins and the political and cultural weight that different ancestral claims carry in the specific context of federal recognition and cultural identity. The Roanoke colonist claim is one strand in a complex ancestry, not a totality. The genetic research that has been conducted on Lumbee and Hatteras communities has produced results that are consistent with European admixture, but that cannot specify the origin of that admixture with the precision that would confirm the Roanoke colonist hypothesis specifically. The limitation is inherent in the nature of the evidence. DNA from the late 16th century and DNA from later European contacts look similar enough at the resolution of current analysis that distinguishing between them is not straightforward. What the genetic evidence confirms is that the communities in question have mixed ancestry, which is consistent with the integration theory, but also consistent with other explanations for European genetic contribution. The documentary record of the colonial period, from the Jamestown era forward, includes occasional references to indigenous people with English speech and English ancestry in various parts of the Carolina region. The earliest of these references, from the first decades of the 17th century, are the closest in time to the 1587 colony, and therefore the most likely to reflect a genuine inheritance from the Roanoke period. Later references might reflect any number of subsequent contacts with Europeans, but the earliest ones, if they refer to people in the areas that the colonists would have reached, carry weight as possible evidence of the integration that the Croatoan theory proposes. John Lawson's 1709 account of his travels through the Carolina interior includes a notable passage about the people of the Hatteras area. He noted that they had a tradition of English ancestry, that they could talk much of the English, and that several of their ancestors were white people. Lawson was not a rigorous historian in the modern sense, and his notes reflect the casual attitudes of a travel writer of his period toward the people he was observing, but the specific claim of English ancestry attributed to the Hatteras people is the kind of detail that a travel writer would have no particular reason to invent. The tradition Lawson recorded in 1709 was approximately a century and a quarter old enough to have become somewhat vague, but young enough to have been preserved in recognizable form in the community's oral tradition. The specific detail that the tradition connected English ancestry to gray eyes, which Lawson noted as a physical characteristic of the people he observed, is the kind of specific, embodied claim that tends to persist in oral traditions when it is grounded in actual physical observation across generations. Gray eyes are unusual enough in indigenous communities without European admixture to be noticed and remembered as distinctive, and the connection that the Hatteras people themselves drew between gray eyes and English ancestry suggests a tradition of understanding specific physical characteristics as markers of specific ancestry. This is not conclusive evidence. It is one piece of a larger pattern, and the pattern is what gives the Croatoan integration theory its current status among researchers, not proved, but strongly supported by a convergence of different types of evidence pointing in the same direction. The archaeological evidence, the documentary evidence, the oral tradition, and the genetic evidence all point toward a conclusion that is consistent with what John White wrote when he described what he found on Roanoke Island in August 1590, consistent with the signal system he had established and with the specific word that the colonists had chosen to carve. The specific question of motive, of why the colonists chose to go to Croatoan rather than to wait longer for White's return, has been addressed implicitly by the evidence of what they found themselves in. 3 years is a long time. The colony had arrived with supplies that were never sufficient for sustained self-reliance. had supplemented them with whatever trade and exchange with indigenous people the complex political situation allowed, and had spent 3 years in a state of uncertainty about their future that would have worn down the most determined optimists in the group. By the 3rd year, the colonists who were still alive, and whatever proportion of the original 15, had survived the specific attritions of disease and exposure and the ongoing difficulties of their situation, would have had to make a realistic assessment of their prospects. White was not coming, or white was coming eventually, but eventually was not soon enough, and the resources available to them on Roanoke Island were insufficient to maintain the colony much longer. The Croatoan had demonstrated over 3 years that they were willing to maintain their alliance. The choice to go to Croatoan was not a surrender. It was a practical calculation made by people who understood their situation clearly and who made the only decision that offered them a viable future. The carved word was the most important thing they did before they left. It was their communication with the man who had failed to come back, the man who was their governor and their link to the empire that had sent them and then abandoned them. The word told him they were not dead. It told him where they were. It told him, by the absence of the distress signal, that the departure had not been under duress, that this was a choice made freely by people who were, at the moment they left, still capable of making choices. Whether White ever fully understood what they had done, whether he understood that the carving was a message of survival rather than a mystery of disappearance, is not clear from the record. His account of the return suggests that he understood the carving as indicating a destination, not a death. He wanted to go to Croatoan. He believed that if he could get there, he would find them or find information about where they had gone from there. The weather that prevented him from making the 50-mile journey was not just an inconvenience. It was the specific accident of circumstance that made the question permanent, that prevented the one man who could have followed the arrow from following it and giving us the specific, personal account of what he found. The investigation that the 21st century is conducting, with its ground-penetrating radar and its careful trowels and its DNA analysis and its satellite imagery of the Carolina coastlines, is the investigation that White was prevented from conducting in the 16th century. It is slower and more indirect, working from physical traces and documentary fragments rather than from living testimony, but it is pointing toward the same answer that the word on the post pointed toward, south, to Hatteras Island, to the Croatoan. The lost colony of Roanoke is one of the foundational stories of American history, and the specific way in which it has been understood across the centuries says something important about what American culture has wanted its own founding to mean. The story of 115 people who vanished without trace, absorbed by the wilderness, consumed by the unknown darkness of the New World, fit a narrative about the precariousness of the colonial enterprise and the danger that lurked beyond the boundaries of English civilization. The alternative story, the story the evidence is beginning to tell, is less dramatic in one sense and more interesting in another. The colonists of Roanoke did not vanish. They made a choice. They chose the people who were willing to have them over the empire that had forgotten them. They integrated into a world that was already fully inhabited and fully organized and fully alive with the specific richness of a culture that the English had encountered and failed to properly understand. Their descendants, if the evidence is correct, are among the people of the Carolina coast and interior who carry in their genes and in their oral traditions the specific inheritance of that choice. Croatoan. The word is the beginning of the story, not the end of it. It points toward Hatteras Island, toward the community that received the colonists and made room for them in its world. It points toward the mixing that produced the people who carry fragments of two cultures in their memories and their bodies. It points toward the answer to the question that 440 years of wondering has been unable to fully answer because the people who were doing the wondering were looking in the wrong place. The word was not a mystery. It was never a mystery. It was an answer, carved into wood by people who had made their decision and were going to where the answer pointed. They went to Croatoan. The archaeology is finding them there. The work of finding them fully, of understanding what their integration into the Croatoan world produced and what became of their descendants in the 4 centuries since, continues. The empire forgot them. The people they joined did not.